The winding road into deep Appalachia felt like a thread pulled tight through a patchwork quilt of rugged hills and dense forests. I'm Emma, a 29-year-old folklorist from Virginia, driven by a restless curiosity for the old stories whispered in places where the modern world seems to thin at the edges. When I decided to journey into the heart of Appalachia to gather the winding road into deep Appalachia felt like a thread pulled tight through a patchwork quilt of rugged hills and dense forests. I'm Emma, a 29-year-old folklorist from Virginia, driven by a restless curiosity for the old stories whispered in places where the modern world seems to thin at the edges. When I decided to journey into the heart of Appalachia to gather authentic legends, I imagined dusty tomes and crackling firesides sharing tales passed down through generations. What I found was something far more elusive, wrapped in shadows that stretched longer than the day. My arrival was just as the sun dipped behind the craggy ridges, casting a deep amber glow over the small mountain town of Eldridge. It was a place that looked untouched by time, where the wooden porches sagged with age and the streets were lined with weather-beaten signs advertising everything from moonshine to handcrafted quilts. But beneath the surface of this picturesque town was an unmistakable reluctance, a reticence that pulled at the corners of conversations and settled like a fog over the locals' eyes. I checked into a modest inn run by a woman named Mabel, whose smile was quick but never quite reached the sorrow in her eyes. Over dinner, I tried to coax stories from her, hoping to unravel the fabric of local lore. But Mabel's words were measured, her stories half-told and quickly withdrawn, as if speaking too freely might awaken something better left sleeping. "There's things you don't want to know around here," she warned softly, sliding a steaming bowl of stew across the table. "But if you're set on a skin, best keep your wits about you." That night, as I lay in the creaky bed beneath a quilt patterned with fading stars, the stillness of Eldridge pressed close. The wind whispered through the cracks in the window frame, carrying with it a chorus of distant, indistinct sounds: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of dry leaves, the faint crack of twigs snapping under unseen feet. It was a lullaby and a warning all at once. Determined not to be deterred, I spent the next morning walking the narrow streets and sidling into the local diner, where the scent of strong coffee mingled with the murmur of hushed conversations. I introduced myself to a few of the townsfolk, each face a story waiting to be told. But the deeper I probed, the more tightly the threads of their tales were held. Many offered polite smiles and changed the subject. Others simply shook their heads and muttered, "Not much to tell here." It wasn't until I met Old Tom, a weathered woodsman with a beard as tangled as the forest undergrowth, that the first true crack appeared in the town's veil of silence. He sat at the edge of the diner, nursing black coffee and staring out the window with eyes as sharp as broken glass. When I asked about local legends, his gaze flickered briefly toward the hills, and he leaned in, voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "There's stories, sure enough," he said, fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the table. "Folks round here speak low about the hollow man ain't a man, not really. More like a shadow that walks when the sun starts set in. Lost hunters, woodsmen, some never come back after seeing him. Folks say he's got no face, just a dark, empty space where a man's soul ought to be." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the diner. "No face?" I asked. Tom nodded slowly. "Ain't supposed to speak. Ain't got no breath. Just silence. But he's watchin', always watchin'. If you hear the quiet come close, best you don't turn around." That evening, I made my way toward the edge of the forest, the trees standing like silent sentinels under the bruised sky. My recorder was in my pocket, ready to capture any whispered fragments of the stories I sought. The air grew cooler as the light faded, and the sounds of the forest shifted from welcoming to watchful. Somewhere deep in the shadows, a branch snapped, sharp and sudden. I stopped, heart pounding, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being observed tightened around me like a noose. Retreating to the safety of my cabin, I tried to shake off the unease. But in the stillness of the night, the absence of normal forest sounds was deafening. No rustling critters, no chirping insects, only a heavy silence that pressed against the walls. Then, faintly, I heard it, the softest of sounds, like a breath held too long or a footstep cushioned by moss. I turned, flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing but the empty room. Sleep was elusive. I kept the light on and the door locked, my mind racing through Tom's words. Was it my imagination playing tricks, or had the Hollow Man come to remind me that some stories are warnings, not just tales to be told? Over the following days, I sought out more locals, each hesitant but gradually opening as trust grew thin but steady. I met Martha, a schoolteacher who spoke of the mountain as if it were a living thing, full of secrets and old grief. She told me about the heavy silence that sometimes fell, how even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "The hills remember," she said softly. "They remember those who listen too closely." In the market, I encountered a young man named Caleb, whose family had lived in Eldridge for generations. He was wary but shared fragments of stories overheard as a child. Whispers of strange figures seen at dusk, shadows moving against the fading light, and the sudden, inexplicable cold that would sweep through the hollows. My granddaddy used to say the forest doesn't like strangers poking around after dark, Caleb said, eyes darting toward the tree line. "It's best to keep your head down and your steps quiet." Each fragment I gathered wove a tapestry of unease and reverence. These were not just ghost stories meant to scare children. They were living memories, warnings etched into the very soul of the community. The people of Eldridge seemed caught between knowing and not knowing, their voices trembling on the edge of confession and silence. One afternoon, as I walked along a narrow path leading toward the hills, I stumbled across a small clearing where the undergrowth had been trampled flat, as if something large had passed through recently. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed to cling to the edges of vision. I knelt to examine the ground and noticed faint impressions, barely discernible footprints that didn't match any animal I knew. The shapes were elongated and irregular, fading into the dark soil as if something had been dragged rather than walked. A shiver ran down my spine. I pulled out my notebook and jotted down the details, my hands trembling slightly. This was no ordinary forest, no mere backdrop for rustic legends. There was a presence here that defied explanation, something both ancient and patient, watching from the dark. That night, I sat by the window of my room, the town quiet beneath the stars. The wind whispered once again, threading through the trees with a voice that almost seemed to call my name. I pressed my ear to the glass, half expecting to hear the shadowy figure Tom spoke of. Instead, there was only silence, heavy, oppressive, and waiting. I realized then that my journey into deep Appalachia had only just begun. The stories were alive here, tangled with the hills and the people who called this place home. And as the night deepened, I understood that some legends are not just tales to be collected. They are warnings, murmured through the ages, urging those who listen to be careful what they seek. Tomorrow, I would return to the woods, hoping to learn more, but also fearing what I might find lurking in the fading light. The Hollow Man was out there somewhere, and the hills were watching. The next morning dawned cold and gray, the heavy clouds pressing low against the hills like a warning in the sky. I awoke with the memory of the night's silence still lingering in my mind, the faint echo of breathless wind threading through the trees. I knew I had to press on, to chase the whispers that tangled themselves in the roots of this land. That day, I returned to the diner, hoping to meet more of Eldridge's storytellers and perhaps find someone who could tell me more about the Hollow Man. It was there I found Hank, a grizzled hunter with hands like knotted roots and eyes that held years of forest secrets. He sat alone at a corner table, nursing a black coffee and staring into the distance as if watching something only he could see. When I approached, he gave me a long, appraising look before nodding and gesturing to the seat across from him. "Folks don't like talking about him much," Hank said quietly. "But I reckon you're not here to scare easy. You want to hear what happened to my buddy Earl?" I nodded, leaning in. Hank's voice dropped even lower, gravelly and slow, pulling me closer into the web of his tale. Earl was a good man, a hunter like me. One evening, just as the sun was bleeding out behind the ridges, Earl went out looking for a lost hound. He never came back. We found his truck by the edge of the woods, but Earl himself was gone, as if swallowed by the forest itself. Some say he ran into the Hollow Man. He paused, eyes darkening. Earl told me once he caught a glimpse of a figure, tall, thin, and faceless, just a hole where a face should be. Not a soul, just emptiness. The air went cold, like the warmth had been sucked right out of the world. Earl said he felt a silence so deep it crushed him, and then the figure vanished. I shivered despite the warmth of the diner. Did Earl ever say what happened after? Hank shook his head. No, Earl just disappeared. No sign, no trace. Like the forest took him, and it don't give back what it claims. That evening, armed with Hank's story, I made my way back to the forest's edge. The sky was bruised purple and orange, the last light slipping away like sand through fingers. As I stepped beneath the canopy, the temperature dropped sharply, the air growing thick and heavy. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, were muted, swallowed by an oppressive stillness. I moved cautiously, my flashlight casting long, trembling beams between the trees. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I caught a shadow slipping between trunks, too tall and too fluid to be a deer or a stray animal. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned abruptly, but the space was empty. The silence pressed in, punctuated only by the distant crack of a branch. I whispered Earl's name, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, a cold gust swept through the trees, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone breathing just out of reach. I froze, every instinct screaming to flee, but my feet remained rooted. The wind shifted, and I caught the faintest glimpse of a tall, thin silhouette standing at the edge of the clearing. No face, just a dark void where features should have been, outlined against the dying light. It was as if the air itself had been hollowed out. I swallowed hard and forced myself to take a step forward. The figure didn't move, but the silence around it felt alive, pressing against my skin and seeping into my bones. I reached for my recorder, fumbling to turn it on, hoping to capture something. Anything that would explain the impossible. The moment the device clicked on, the silhouette dissolved into the gathering shadows, leaving behind a suffocating silence that seemed to swallow the forest whole. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away, retracing my steps to the cabin with the weight of Hank's story settling into my chest like a stone. That night, I reviewed the audio, hoping to find some hint of the encounter. The recording was filled with static and low hums, but beneath that, I caught a faint whisper, an eerie, breathless sound that seemed to echo my own name, stretched thin and hollow. It was barely audible, but unmistakably there. Sleep was out of reach. I kept the recorder close, straining to hear any repetition of the whisper. The wind outside howled softly, and the shadows in my room seemed to pulse with unseen movement. I gripped my notebook tightly, the rough edges digging into my palm, as I tried to make sense of the night's terror. On the third day, driven by a mix of dread and determination, I ventured deeper into the forest, past the tangled underbrush where the trees grew closer together and the light struggled to break through. The air was colder here, the silence thicker, as if the forest itself was holding a secret beneath its roots. After hours of careful exploration, I stumbled upon a small clearing where a cabin stood in ruin, its wooden walls scorched and blackened as if fire had tried and failed to consume it. The scent of burnt wood and damp earth hung heavy in the air. I hesitated at the threshold, the eerie quiet pressing down like a physical weight. Inside, scattered papers lay strewn across the floor, yellowed with age and curling at the edges. Among them, I found a journal, its leather cover cracked but intact. The handwriting inside was hurried and shaky, the last entry chilling in its warning. Do not listen. The forest speaks, but it lies. It waits for you to hear, to answer. Once you do, you belong to the hollow. My breath caught, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The words seemed to thrum with a dark energy, as if the cabin itself was a trap set for anyone foolish enough to listen. I stepped outside, heart pounding, and caught movement in the trees, a tall, thin silhouette watching me from the shadows. Panic surged, and I fled back toward the cabin, the forest twisting around me, swallowing the path I thought I knew. My breaths came ragged and fast as I stumbled through the undergrowth, desperate to reach safety. Once inside, I locked the door and slid down the wall, my hands shaking. The forest's silence pressed in, but I refused to listen. I told myself it was just an old story, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew the Hollow Man was real, and that it had found me. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and haunted mornings. The whispers returned, growing louder, calling my name in breathless tones. I caught glimpses of that faceless shadow at the edge of my vision, always watching, always waiting. Despite the warnings, I knew I had to go back. The story wasn't finished, and the forest still held its secrets tight. But with every step deeper into the darkness, the Hollow Man's presence grew stronger, a silent sentinel at the edge of my world. And in the quiet moments, when the wind stilled and the night pressed close, I could almost hear it, waiting for me to listen. The days in Eldridge grew shorter, the sun dipping behind the hills faster than before, leaving long shadows to stretch across the worn wooden porches and narrow lanes. Despite the unsettling encounters with the Hollow Man, I found myself drawn deeper into the tangled web of stories that clung to this place. It was during one of my visits to the town's small market that I met Lila, a soft-spoken woman with eyes like storm clouds and a voice that trembled as she spoke. She invited me to her modest home on the edge of town, promising to share a story that had haunted her family for generations. Inside her cozy kitchen, warmed by the flicker of a wood stove, Lila unfolded the tragic tale of the weeping woman of the Hollow. She told me about a grief-stricken mother who, driven by despair, drowned her own children in a nearby creek long ago. Since then, the woman's sorrowful spirit was said to wander the hollows, her mournful cries echoing through the night and chilling anyone who heard them to the bone. The creek runs cold all year round, Lila said, her hands trembling as she poured tea. People say you can still hear her crying when the wind blows just right, like the earth itself is weeping. Driven by a mixture of fascination and unease, I decided to visit the creek as twilight settled over the hills. The path was narrow and lined with gnarled trees whose branches reached out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with damp earth and the scent of moss, and the sound of water running over smooth stones was a constant, gentle murmur. As the last light faded, I stood at the creek's edge, watching the dark water swirl beneath the overhanging trees. Suddenly, a chill swept across the hollow, and the atmosphere shifted. From somewhere upstream, a sorrowful wail rose, carried on the cold wind like a mournful lament. The sound was raw and aching, a deep cry that seemed to seep into the bones of the land itself. I froze, heart pounding, as the cries grew louder, echoing through the hollow and wrapping around me like a shroud. It was no ordinary sound. It was the voice of a grief too vast to understand, a sorrow that transcended time. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I found myself whispering a silent prayer, hoping the spirit would spare me its anguish. The night deepened, and the cries faded into the distance, leaving behind a heavy silence that felt alive with unseen presence. I lingered a moment longer, feeling the weight of the story settle inside me. This was not just a ghost tale. It was a wound etched into the land, a sorrow that had never healed. Returning to Lila's home, I asked about any encounters others might have had with the weeping woman. She hesitated, her eyes darkening with memory. Some folks say she appears as a pale figure in a white dress, her eyes hollow and filled with endless grief. Others say she calls your name, begging for help she can never find. That night, back in my cabin, I lay awake, the haunting wails replaying in my mind. As the clock ticked past midnight, a faint sound drifted in through the cracked window, a soft, sorrowful crying carried on the wind. I sat up, heart racing, and peered into the darkness, but all I saw were the swaying shadows of the trees. The line between legend and reality blurred as I grappled with the stories that seemed to seep from the very soil. Was the weeping woman a restless spirit bound by grief, or a manifestation of the land's ancient pain? I couldn't tell, but the weight of her sorrow pressed down on me, an echo of loss that refused to fade. Determined to understand more, I spoke with others who had lived in Eldridge all their lives. Many avoided the topic, their voices hushed and eyes distant. Yet, a few shared whispered memories of nights when the cries had startled them awake, or when a pale figure had been glimpsed near the creek, vanishing like mist before they could call out. One elderly man told me of a time when the creek had flooded, and the town had gathered to pray for release from the spirit's torment. Since then, the wails had lessened but never ceased. The story was a reminder that the past here was never truly past, that grief could linger in the land like a shadow. I felt the hollow sorrow settle into my bones as I walked the town's quiet streets, the weeping woman's lament a haunting refrain beneath the rustling leaves. The forest was no longer just a place of shadows, but a vessel of pain and memory, a place where the living and the dead seemed to brush against one another in the fading light. Each encounter with these stories deepened my sense of connection to Eldritch, but also my unease. The legends were not merely tales to be collected. They were warnings, echoes of lives shattered and souls unsettled. And as the night wrapped its cold arms around the town, I realized that the weeping woman's sorrow was far from over, still reaching out through the hollows, calling for help that might never come. The weight of the weeping woman's sorrow lingered with me like a cold shadow as the days slipped quietly into dusk. Yet, Eldridge's secrets were far from exhausted. The stories I gathered grew darker, more urgent, as if the hills themselves were eager to reveal their hidden terrors. It was during a late afternoon at the local general store that I first heard whispers about the black dog of the ridge, a creature spoken of in hushed tones, a harbinger of death and misfortune. I was browsing through dusty shelves when I overheard a conversation between two men, their voices low and tense. One described a monstrous black dog with eyes like burning embers, prowling the ridges after the fog rolled in. "It's no ordinary beast," the man said, glancing nervously toward the window. "Seen it twice myself. Folks around here reckon it's a sign. When it shows, trouble follows." Intrigued, I sought out Mary, an elderly woman known for her sharp memory and knowledge of local lore. In her cluttered living room, surrounded by faded photographs and dried herbs, she recounted the chilling tales passed down through generations. "The black dog's been here longer than any of us," she said, voice trembling. "It's a shadow on the ridge, eyes glowing red like lanterns in the night. Those who see it, they don't live long after." Mary's stories were filled with disappearances and tragedies linked to the spectral hound. Families torn apart, hunters gone missing, and strange accidents on the mountain roads, all whispered to be the black dog's doing. "It's a warning, or maybe a curse," she said, gripping my hand tightly. "You don't want to cross its path." That evening, as fog rolled thick over the hills, I decided to venture toward the ridge where the black dog was said to roam. The forest was swallowed in gray mist, the air damp and heavy with the scent of pine and earth. My flashlight pierced through the fog, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the leaf-strewn path. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught a pair of glowing eyes, red and unblinking, watching me from the underbrush. My breath hitched, and I froze, heart pounding in my chest. A low growl rumbled through the fog, vibrating in the air like a warning. The eyes disappeared, but the sense of being hunted remained. I spun around, trying to catch another glimpse, but there was only mist and the whispering trees. Panic surged, and I broke into a run, the fog thickening as if trying to swallow me whole. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps pounding the earth, close and relentless. I dared a glance back and saw a massive black shape bounding through the mist, eyes blazing like coals. The chase was a blur of fear and desperation. Branches clawed at my face and clothes as I sprinted blindly through the forest, the growls closing in. My lungs burned, legs trembling, but I couldn't stop. Every instinct screamed to escape the nightmare stalking me. Finally, I burst out of the trees onto an old logging road, panting and soaked with sweat. The footsteps halted at the edge of the fog, and the glowing eyes faded into the darkness. I didn't look back again until I reached the safety of the town. In the days that followed, I pieced together more accounts of the black dog's appearances. Each story was a thread in a tapestry of dread, a supernatural omen marking the beginning of tragedy. Locals spoke of how the dog's howl could be heard on stormy nights, a mournful sound that sent chills through the bones. One man told me how his father once encountered the black dog on a foggy evening while tending to livestock. The beast's eyes glowed like fire, and its breath was cold as death. The next morning, his father was found unconscious by the roadside, and shortly after, a series of misfortunes befell their family. The black dog was more than a creature. It was a symbol, a living nightmare woven into the very fabric of the ridge. It embodied fear itself, a relentless force that preyed on the vulnerable and marked the doomed. As I reflected on these stories, I realized the legends of Eldridge were not isolated shadows, but threads of a darker tapestry. The Hollow Man, the Weeping Woman, and now the Black Dog, all echoed with a common theme of loss, warning, and the unseen dangers lurking just beyond sight. That night, the fog rolled back in, thick and suffocating. From my cabin, I heard a distant howl, mournful and low, weaving through the hills like a breath of despair. The Black Dog's presence was alive and waiting, a reminder that some legends are not just stories. They are warnings etched into the night, urging caution and respect for the darkness that dwells in the ridges. With every passing day, the forest seemed to tighten its grip, the shadows growing longer and the silence deeper. And I knew that the Black Dog was still out there, prowling the mists, its eyes watching, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to wander into its domain. The weight of the stories I'd gathered in Eldridge pressed on me like the dense Appalachian fog that clung to the ridges at dawn. The Hollow Man, the Weeping Woman, the Black Dog, they weren't just isolated shadows in the night, but intertwined threads woven into the very soul of this land. Each legend carried a warning, a whisper of darkness that demanded respect, lest you be consumed by it. I found myself walking the town's quiet streets one evening, the sun slipping behind the hills and casting long, uneasy shadows. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the distant call of a lone owl punctuated the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by any one person, but by the land itself, alive with memory and sorrow. The Hollow Man's empty gaze lingered in my mind, a faceless void that swallowed warmth and light. The Weeping Woman's mournful cries echoed in my ears, a sorrow so vast it seemed to seep from the ground beneath my feet. And the Black Dog's glowing eyes haunted the edges of my vision, a spectral predator stalking the ridges with relentless intent. I sat alone in my cabin, worn journal open on my lap, the pages filled with hurried notes and sketches. The stories I'd collected were more than folklore. They were living entities, reminders of a past that refused to die, warnings etched into the landscape and whispered through the trees. I realized that the people of Eldridge lived with these legends not as distant tales, but as palpable realities, their lives shaped and shadowed by the unseen forces that prowled the woods. Late one night, as the wind moaned softly outside, I heard a faint whisper drifting through the cracked window, a voice at once familiar and foreign, calling my name with breathless urgency. I held my breath, heart pounding, and then silence swallowed the sound. The presence was there, hovering at the edge of perception, a reminder that these stories were not just echoes of the past, but living shadows that still watched. I reached out to others who had survived encounters with these legends, finding a quiet network of souls bound by shared fear and understanding. They spoke of lingering shadows, restless spirits, and unexplainable phenomena, proof that the mysteries of Eldridge were far from settled. Some had tried to escape, only to find the forest's grasp reaching beyond the hills, invading dreams and reflections. Despite the fear, there was a strange comfort in this connection, a realization that the stories were also a form of protection, a way to honor the land's power and the lives touched by its darkness. The legends carried warnings wrapped in sorrow, urging respect for the fragile boundary between the known and the unknown. In the days that followed, I felt the presence of the Hollow Man in the stillness of the woods, the Weeping Woman in the lingering mist over the creek, and the Black Dog in the restless rustling of the ridge's leaves. They were watchers, guardians of a shadowed realm that existed alongside our own, reminding me that some places hold secrets that never fully reveal themselves. One evening, as the sky faded to twilight and the first stars blinked awake, I stood at the edge of the forest, feeling the cool breath of the wind against my skin. I whispered a silent promise to the land, to remember, to respect, and to share these tales so others might heed the warnings carried on the Appalachian breeze. The mountains held their secrets tight, their shadows long and deep. But I knew now that these legends were alive, breathing through the trees and whispering on the wind, waiting for those who dared to listen. And as I turned back toward the town, I carried with me the weight of their stories and the knowledge that the mysteries of deep Appalachia are not just tales. They are warnings, echoes of a darkness that watches, waits, and endures.